Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Is that a knockoff? Celeste Vance sneered, fingering Eleanor's lace collar in front of the 20 high society dinner guests. The dining room of the Vance Manor, a space Eleanor had curated over 40 years of marriage, felt suddenly like a courtroom. The scent of white lilies, usually a comfort, now felt cloying, mixing with the heavy, metallic tang of the expensive Scotch Julian was pouring at the head of the table. Eleanor felt the familiar sting of a blush creeping up her neck, but she didn't look away. She watched her daughter-in-law's manicured hand drop the fabric as if it were contaminated. "It was a gift from my late husband, Celeste," Eleanor said, her voice thin but steady. "Hand-stitched in Brussels." Celeste laughed, a sharp, melodic sound that drew the attention of the surrounding guests. The city's elite, the very people Julian was desperate to impress. "Brussels? Oh, Eleanor, that was decades ago. Fashion has moved on, even if you haven't. It looks like something from a costume shop." Julian Vance didn't look up from his glass. He adjusted his gold Rolex, a watch Eleanor knew had been purchased with the emergency fund she'd set aside for the estate's maintenance, and cleared his throat. "Celeste is just trying to help you, Mother. You're representing the Vance name tonight. We have the board members here. Appearance is everything." Eleanor looked at her son. He had his father's jawline but none of his character. He sat in the chair that should have been hers, presiding over a dinner paid for by her dwindling dividends, treating her like an unwanted relic from a previous era. "I see," Eleanor murmured. She reached for her water glass, her fingers brushing the cold condensation. The chill was a grounding wire. Across the long mahogany table, Arthur Sterling caught her eye. The old lawyer, a man who had been her husband's closest confidant, offered a microscopic nod. He was the only one in the room who knew the truth of the ledger Eleanor had discovered that morning. He was the only one who knew that the successful investment firm Julian bragged about was a hollow shell, propped up by the systematic liquidation of Eleanor's private holdings. The dinner continued, a choreographed display of Julian's arrogance. He spoke loudly about disrupting markets and legacy building, while Celeste played the perfect hostess, subtly moving Eleanor further down the table to make room for a younger, wealthier couple who had just arrived. "Julian, darling," Celeste said, her voice carrying across the room during a lull in the music. "We really must discuss the guest list for the summer gala. We need to keep it to the truly special people this year, the ones who actually contribute to our social standing." She glanced toward Eleanor with a saccharine smile. "Perhaps your mother would be more comfortable staying at the cottage during the event. It's so much quieter for her there, and we wouldn't want her to feel overwhelmed by the crowd." A few guests chuckled, the sound like the clicking of predatory teeth. Julian nodded, sipping his wine. "You're right, Celeste. It's probably for the best. Mother prefers her tea and her knitting anyway, don't you, Eleanor?" The special people comment hit Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just the insult, it was the casualness of it. They were discussing her life, her home, and her presence as if she were a piece of furniture they were considering moving to the attic. Eleanor's hand moved to her silk clutch, feeling the rectangular weight of the burner phone Isabel Vance had sent her 3 days ago. Her estranged daughter, the one Julian had spent years painting as a troubled runaway to ensure he remained the sole heir, was waiting for a signal. Isabel was a forensic accountant now, a woman who dealt in the cold, hard reality of numbers that Julian had spent the last year faking. Julian leaned forward, his face flushed with the arrogance of a man who thought he had already won. "In fact, Mother, I have those papers for the trust restructuring in the library. I'll need you to sign them before the night is over. It's just a formality to help me manage the taxes on the estate." "The taxes," Eleanor repeated. "Exactly. It's a lot of pressure for a woman your age. Let me handle the heavy lifting." He flashed a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You just focus on being comfortable." Eleanor felt a strange, cold calm settle over her. For years, she had enabled him. She had allowed his greed because she was afraid of the silence a broken family would leave behind. She had let him take the head of the table, let him take the Rolex, and let him treat her like a guest in her own life. But the special people comment had snapped the last thread of her patience. "I think I'll wait on the signatures, Julian," Eleanor said. The table went quiet. It was the first time she had challenged him in public in 3 years. Julian's smile faltered, a flicker of irritation crossing his brow. "Mother, don't be tedious. We discussed this." "We didn't discuss it," Eleanor corrected, her voice gaining a resonance that made the guests at the far end of the table stop their conversations. "You told me. There's a difference." She stood up, the lace of her knockoff collar catching the light of the crystal chandelier. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like the woman who had built this legacy alongside a titan, a woman who knew where every brick was laid and where every secret was buried. "I'm feeling a bit tired," she said, her gaze sweeping over the special people Julian had gathered. "I think I'll retire to the library, but not to sign your papers, Julian." She turned to Arthur Sterling, who was already standing, his expression unreadable to everyone but her. "Arthur, would you join me?" Eleanor asked. "I believe we have a long overdue phone call to make to Isabel. It's time we discuss the real state of the Vance estate." Julian's face went a sickly shade of gray, the arrogance momentarily replaced by a sharp, jagged fear. He started to rise, his chair scraping harshly against the marble floor. "Mother, wait!" Eleanor didn't wait. She walked out of the dining room with her head held high, the sound of her heels steady and rhythmic on the floor. She could feel the eyes of the guests on her back, the whispers starting like a rising tide. She reached the library door and paused, her hand on the heavy oak handle. She looked back at the dining room, where Julian stood frozen, the king of a castle built on sand. 2 days, Julian," she said softly, though she knew he couldn't hear her. 2 days until the board meeting." She stepped into the library and closed the door, the click of the lock echoing in the quiet hallway. The sleeping lion hadn't just woken up, she had started the hunt. The next morning, the sun bled through the heavy velvet curtains of the library, but the warmth failed to reach Eleanor Vance. She sat behind the massive mahogany desk that had once belonged to her husband, her fingers tracing the cold, sharp edge of a silver letter opener. The house was unnervingly quiet, a stark contrast to the whispered chaos of the previous night's dinner. She knew the silence wouldn't last. Julian was a man who thrived on noise and dominance, and he was currently late for the confrontation she knew was coming. The heavy oak doors swung open with a violent thud, and Julian Vance stormed in, the scent of his cloying sandalwood cologne preceding him like a warning. He didn't sit. He leaned over the desk, his knuckles white as he pressed them into the polished wood. "You made a spectacle of yourself last night, Mother," he said, his voice a low, dangerous hiss. "The guests are talking. Celeste spent the entire night in tears because of your episode. We're all very concerned that the grief has finally unhinged you." Eleanor didn't blink. She watched a bead of sweat roll down his temple despite the chill in the room. "Is that what we're calling the truth now, Julian? An episode?" "I've already spoken to Dr. Aris," he continued, ignoring her, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for something to take. "He agrees that a period of supervised rest is best. A facility upstate. It's quiet, private, and most importantly, it will keep you from doing any more damage to the Vance name before the board meeting." The sheer audacity of the threat, the suggestion of a forced sanitarium stay to keep her silent, sent a spark of cold fire through her veins. This was her son, the boy she had shielded from every hardship, now attempting to lock her away like a shameful secret to protect his own theft. "I'm sure Celeste would love that," Eleanor replied, her voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. "It would certainly make it easier for her to finish cataloging my jewelry. I noticed her eyeing the Mercier emeralds last night." The door creaked open again, and Celeste Vance slipped inside, her face a mask of performative pity. She held a porcelain teacup that rattled slightly against its saucer. "Oh, Eleanor, dear, we only want what's best for you. You clearly aren't yourself. Why, you've forgotten to even dress properly today." She gestured vaguely at Eleanor's simple, high-necked wool dress. a far cry from the designer silk Julian demanded she wear to maintain their image. "I am exactly who I need to be, Celeste," Eleanor said. A sharp knock at the door interrupted Julian's impending retort. Arthur Sterling stepped into the room, looking every bit the lion of the legal world he had once been. He carried a slim, weathered leather briefcase that Eleanor recognized instantly. It was the private ledger her husband had kept, the one Julian thought had been lost in the estate fire 3 years ago. Julian straightened, his arrogance momentarily faltering. "Arthur, this is a family matter. I didn't realize you were still on the payroll." "I'm not on the payroll, Julian," Arthur said, his voice like grinding stones. "I'm here as the executor of your father's private mandates. Mandates that, it seems, you have been very busy violating." He placed the briefcase on the desk and popped the latches. The sound was as loud as a gunshot in the tense room. Eleanor reached out, her hand resting on a thick stack of forensic accounting sheets. Julian didn't know that these weren't just records of the estate. They were the records of the shell company Eleanor had quietly established 6 months ago. She had been funneling the family's remaining liquid assets into it, watching through the digital paper trail as Julian tried, and failed, to dip into accounts that were already empty. He had been stealing from a ghost, and the debt he owed to the real estate was now astronomical. 47 hours, Julian," Eleanor said, glancing at the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Each second felt like a hammer blow. "That's how long you have to find the $4 million missing from the foundation accounts before the board sees these." Julian's face went a sickly, mottled purple. "You wouldn't. You'd destroy the family name just to spite me." "The name is already tarnished," she said, standing up. She felt a surge of adrenaline, a dopamine hit of pure, righteous clarity. "I'm just the one who's going to scrub it clean." As she walked toward the door, Arthur at her side, she paused by Celeste, who was frozen with her teacup halfway to her mouth. Eleanor leaned in close, the scent of the bitter, oversteeped Earl Grey tea filling her senses. "Keep the tea, Celeste," Eleanor whispered. "You're going to need something to calm your nerves when the process servers arrive this afternoon." She didn't look back as she left the room, but she heard the distinct, sharp sound of porcelain shattering against the floor. The hunt was no longer a quiet affair. The first blood had been drawn. 2 days after the porcelain shattered at the manor, Eleanor sat in a glass-walled office that overlooked the city's financial district. The air here didn't smell like dust and old secrets. It smelled of ozone and fresh espresso. Arthur Sterling stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the morning sun. Across from Eleanor sat Eleanor Vance. Her daughter's eyes were the same flinty gray as her father's, but there was a warmth there that Julian had never possessed. Isabel slid a sleek, black leather folder across the mahogany desk. "It's all here, Mother," she said, her voice steady. "Julian didn't just skim the foundation accounts. He's been using the Vance family estate as collateral for personal loans to fund Celeste's lifestyle brand in the Caymans. He's been gambling with the roof over your head." Eleanor touched the edge of the paper. It felt heavy, a physical weight of betrayal. The rhythmic clicking of Isabel's keyboard was the only sound in the room for a moment. "He thinks I'm a relic," Eleanor whispered. "He thinks because I was quiet while your father was alive, I don't know how to read a balance sheet." "He's arrogant, Eleanor," Arthur said, turning from the window. He walked over and placed a hand on the back of her chair. "Arrogance breeds sloppiness." He didn't even bother to encrypt the subledgers. He thought no one would ever look. Eleanor's phone buzzed on the desk. The caller ID flashed a photo of Julian smiling at a charity golf tournament. She hesitated, then tapped the speakerphone. "Mother," Julian's voice filled the room, dripping with that faux-concerned tone he used for public appearances. "I hope you've spent the last 48 hours calming down. I've had the staff pack your things, the essentials anyway. You clearly need a sabbatical from the city. I've looked into a lovely assisted living facility in the Berkshires. It's for the best, given your recent outbursts." Eleanor's grip tightened on the arm of her chair. "Assisted living, Julian. It's high-end, Mother." "Don't worry about the cost. Though, speaking of costs, I've had to freeze your personal accounts temporarily. For your own protection, of course. You seem confused about the foundation's finances lately, and I can't have you making erratic decisions." He paused, and she could almost hear the smirk on his face. "And don't bother showing up for the legacy gala on Friday. I've already told the board you're unwell. It would be embarrassing for everyone if you made another scene in front of the special people Celeste has invited." "The special people," Eleanor repeated, her voice like a sharpening blade. "Exactly. Stay in the country, Mother. Rest. I'll have the driver take you up tomorrow morning. Don't make this difficult." The line went dead. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Isabel looked at her mother, her jaw set in a hard line. "He's trying to disappear you, Mother. He wants you tucked away in the woods before the board meeting." "He wants a ghost," Eleanor said, standing up. She felt a surge of cold, calculated energy. "But he's forgotten who actually holds the title to the Vance legacy." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, brushed aluminum flash drive. It felt icy against her palm. This was the result of Arthur's quiet digging and Isabel's legal expertise. A digital map of every shell company, every diverted wire transfer, and every forged signature Julian had used to bleed the family dry. "Is the injunction ready?" Eleanor asked. Isabel nodded, tapping a final key. "Signed, sealed, and ready to be delivered. But if we serve him now, he'll have time to run. He'll hide the assets in the Caymans before we can freeze them." "No," Eleanor said, looking out at the city skyline. "We don't serve him in an office. We serve him where he feels most powerful. He told me not to come to the gala because I'd embarrass the special people. I think it's time those people saw exactly what kind of man Julian Vance really is." Arthur checked his watch. "The gala starts in 48 hours. The board will all be there. The press will be there. Celeste has turned it into a media circus for her new brand." "Perfect," Eleanor said. She turned to her daughter. "Isabel, I want you to prepare a second document, not just the injunction. I want a full revocation of Julian's power of attorney and his removal as chairman of the foundation. I want it ready for public reading." Isabel's eyes widened slightly, then a slow, predatory smile spread across her face. "You're going to do it on the stage. He wants to put me in a home because he thinks I'm a liability," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. "I'm going to show him that the only person losing their home this week is him." She walked toward the door, her heels clicking firmly on the polished floor. She paused at the threshold, looking back at the folder on the desk. 2 days. 48 hours until the Vance Legacy Gala. Julian was currently at the manor, likely drinking her late husband's finest scotch and celebrating a victory he hadn't yet won. He didn't know that the relic he was trying to discard was currently holding the detonator to his entire life. "Arthur," Eleanor said without turning around, "make sure my dress is ready. The gold one. If I'm going to be the guest of honor, I should look the part." As she stepped into the hallway, she felt the weight of the flash drive in her pocket. The countdown had begun. Julian had 48 hours left of being a wealthy man. He just didn't know it yet. The next afternoon, the heavy scent of lilies and floor wax greeted Eleanor Vance as she entered the sun-drenched conservatory of the Vance Manor. Sunlight poured through the glass panes, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a silence that felt brittle, ready to shatter. It was a room that had once been her sanctuary, a place of growth and quiet reflection, but today it had been transformed into a cold marketplace. Julian Vance stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, gesturing expansively to a man in a sharp, slate-gray suit who was meticulously cataloging the antique botanical sketches on the walls. Julian didn't even look up as she approached, his focus entirely on the valuation of her history. "Ah, Mother," he said, his voice smooth but lacking any real warmth. He finally turned, a patronizing smile fixed on his face. "I've taken the liberty of starting the inventory today. No sense in letting these things gather dust when they could be liquid assets for the firm's expansion. We need to clear the books before the transition is finalized tomorrow night." Eleanor felt a sharp prick of indignation, a heat rising in her chest that she carefully suppressed. She kept her expression as cool as the marble floor beneath her feet. "Those sketches were a wedding gift from your father, Julian. They are personal property, not part of the firm's assets. He stepped closer, invading her personal space with the casual confidence of someone who had already won. Technically, everything within these walls falls under the umbrella of the estate, which I am now managing. You really should be focusing on packing your personal effects instead of worrying about the decor. It's for the best, really. A fresh start. Eleanor reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the cold, hard edges of the flash drive. The sensation was grounding, a secret anchor in a sea of his arrogance. She felt the weight of the evidence against him, the years of systematic theft, and the forged documents that Isabel Vance had helped her verify just hours ago. Management is a heavy word, Julian, she replied, her voice steady. It requires a level of scrutiny and integrity I'm not sure you've fully prepared for. Are you quite certain the records will stand up to the light of day? He laughed, a dry, grating sound that echoed against the glass walls. Scrutiny. I've been running the numbers for months. The only thing I'm not prepared for is your sudden, frantic interest in business. It's a bit late for a hobby, don't you think? Just enjoy your retirement. Let the professionals handle the heavy lifting. Arthur Sterling stepped out from behind a large, ornamental palm, a leather-bound ledger tucked under his arm. He caught Eleanor's eye, a brief, knowing glint passing between them. He had seen the shift in her, the way her shoulders no longer slumped under her son's dismissive remarks. He saw the steel in her gaze that Julian was too blinded by ego to notice. The preliminary audit for the gala's presentation is nearly complete, Eleanor, Arthur said, his tone professional but laced with a subtle undercurrent of support. Julian rolled his eyes, adjusting his silk tie in the reflection of a display case. Arthur, stop indulging her. We have a legacy to secure. The Vance name needs to be associated with growth and power, not sentimental nostalgia. The sharp click of designer heels announced the arrival of Celeste Vance. She swept into the room, draped in a cream-colored wrap that cost more than most people earned in a year. She was carrying a stack of fabric swatches for the gala's table linens, her eyes scanning the room with a predatory sense of ownership. "Oh, Eleanor, you're still here," Celeste said, her voice dripping with a sugary, fake concern. "I thought you'd be at that little apartment Isabel found for you by now. It's so much more manageable for someone in your position. This drafty old house really is too much for a woman alone." The insult hung in the air, a blatant attempt to remind Eleanor of her supposed displacement. Celeste didn't even wait for a response before turning to her husband. "Darling, the gold linens are perfect for the ballroom. They scream new era, don't they? Out with the old, in with the gold." Eleanor watched them, her son and his wife, remodeling a life they hadn't earned and celebrating a victory they hadn't yet secured. She thought of the countdown ticking away in her mind. 24 hours. "Enjoy the gold, Celeste," Eleanor said, her voice eerily calm. "It's a very bright color. It makes it quite difficult for anything to stay hidden in the shadows." Julian frowned, his brow furrowing for a fraction of a second as he looked at his mother. Her confidence was starting to grate on him, a discordant note in his symphony of control. 24 hours, Mother. After the gala, the transition becomes official. I suggest you spend the night making peace with that." Eleanor turned toward the door, her movements fluid and purposeful. "I've already made my peace, Julian. I'm looking forward to tomorrow. I want everyone to see exactly what the Vance legacy has become." As she walked away, she didn't look back. She could feel Julian's eyes on her, confused and annoyed, but she didn't care. The night before the end had arrived, and she had never felt more awake. Tomorrow, the gold would lose its luster. The evening of the Vance Foundation Gala arrived with a chilling, clinical precision. The grand ballroom of the Sterling Hotel was a cavern of white marble and gold leaf, smelling of expensive lilies and the sharp, metallic scent of floor wax. A string quartet played in the gallery, the frantic bowing of the cellist creating a low, vibrating hum that Eleanor Vance felt in her very marrow. She stood at the edge of the room, her hand resting on the cold velvet of a draped table. She wasn't wearing the muted gray her son had suggested. Instead, she wore a vintage silk gown in a shade of midnight blue, so deep it was almost black, and around her neck hung the Vance emeralds. A set Julian had assumed were already locked in a safe deposit box he controlled. She watched the room through a lens of newfound clarity. Julian Vance was at the center of a circle of donors, his laughter sounding like the brittle snap of dry kindling. He looked every bit the successor, polished, commanding, and utterly hollow. Beside him, Celeste Vance shimmered in a dress of aggressive gold sequins that caught the light with every performative gesture of her glass. "There she is," Celeste said, her voice cutting through the music as she spotted Eleanor. She glided over, the scratchy lace of her sleeve brushing against Eleanor's arm as she reached out, not in affection, but to steer her. "Eleanor, darling, you look bold. But don't you think the emeralds are a bit heavy for tonight? You look a little tired under all that weight." Eleanor didn't flinch. She felt the cool, hard edges of the flash drive tucked into the hidden pocket of her clutch, the weight that actually mattered. "The weight is exactly what I expected it to be, Celeste. Some things are meant to be carried until the very end." Julian joined them, his eyes immediately dropping to the jewels around his mother's neck. A flicker of irritation crossed his face, gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a mask of condescending concern. "Mother, I thought we discussed the schedule. You were supposed to be seated in the VIP lounge 10 minutes ago. It's quieter there, less taxing for you." "I prefer the noise tonight, Julian," she replied, her voice steady as a heartbeat. "I want to hear everything." Julian's smile didn't reach his eyes. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her. "Don't make this difficult. Tonight is about the transition. The board is here, the press is here, and Arthur Sterling is already asking why the paperwork hasn't been signed. Stay in the quiet corner, play the part of the proud mother, and let me handle the heavy lifting. You've done enough." He patted her hand, a gesture so patronizing it made the air in Eleanor's lungs turn to ice. He treated her like a fading ghost in her own house, a nuisance to be managed until she could be safely tucked away. "I'm sure she understands, Julian," Celeste chimed in, her eyes scanning the room for more important targets. "After all, special people like us have to keep up appearances. We wouldn't want the donors thinking the Vance legacy is..." Faltering. Eleanor watched them walk away, Julian's hand possessively on the small of his wife's back. They were so certain of their victory that they had stopped looking for the trap. She turned her gaze toward the back of the room and caught the eye of Arthur Sterling. The old lawyer stood near the mahogany doors, his expression unreadable to anyone else, but Eleanor saw the slight, sharp nod he gave her. Beside him stood Isabel Vance, her daughter's face a mask of iron-willed composure. Isabel had the documents. Arthur had the authority, and Eleanor had the truth. The sensory overload of the room, the clinking of crystal flutes, the heavy perfume of the socialites, the suffocating warmth of the heaters, seemed to fade into a dull roar. Eleanor felt a strange, detached sense of peace. She was the only one in the room who knew the foundation of the building was already on fire. "Wait for it," she whispered to herself, the words lost in the swell of the music. A hush began to ripple through the crowd as the master of ceremonies approached the podium. Julian straightened his tie, his chest swelling with the practiced arrogance of a man about to inherit a kingdom. He glanced back at Eleanor one last time, a look of smug triumph on his face, as if he were checking to ensure his favorite piece of furniture was still in its place. He began to walk toward the stage, his gait confident, his shadow long against the marble floor. The board members, men in charcoal suits who had looked through Eleanor for years, began to applaud. They saw the future in Julian. They saw a man they could deal with, a man who valued profit over the messy business of legacy. Eleanor moved then, not toward the VIP lounge, but toward the tech booth hidden behind a silk curtain. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were like stone. Every step felt like reclaiming a piece of the life she had let Julian dismantle. She saw Isabel move into position near the main stage, a thick manila envelope tucked under her arm. Julian reached the podium and tapped the microphone. The sound echoed through the ballroom like a gavel. The room went silent, 300 pairs of eyes fixing on the man who was about to announce the new era of the Vance Foundation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian began, his voice booming with a manufactured warmth that made Eleanor's skin crawl. "Tonight, we don't just celebrate our past. We celebrate a seamless transition into a future where the Vance name stands for more than just history. It stands for absolute, unyielding growth." He paused for effect, his smirk widening as he looked directly at the front row where the most powerful investors sat. "But before we finalize the official transition, there is a matter of clarity that needs to be addressed. A matter of who truly holds the keys to this legacy." Eleanor reached the curtain of the tech booth. She could see Julian's profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the absolute certainty in his posture. He was seconds away from the speech that would legally strip her of everything. She felt the flash drive in her hand, the cold metal a promise of the storm to come. Julian took a deep breath, his hand gripping the sides of the podium. "I'd like to call my mother, Eleanor, to the stage. Mother, if you would join me for the final signing." The spotlight swung toward the corner where Eleanor had been standing, but the beam landed on empty air. A murmur of confusion began to stir in the back of the room. Julian's brow furrowed, his eyes searching the shadows. Eleanor stepped out from behind the curtain, not toward the stage, but toward the center of the floor, directly under the crystal chandelier. "I'm right here, Julian," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying a weight that silenced the murmurs. "And I think everyone should see exactly what we're signing tonight." Eleanor Vance didn't move. She watched her son from the center of the ballroom, the crystal prisms of the chandelier casting sharp, fractured light across her face. Julian Vance remained at the podium, his knuckles white against the dark wood. For a heartbeat, the only sound in the room was the low, rhythmic hum of the ventilation system and the distant clink of a server's tray in the back. "Mother, please," he said, his voice straining for a paternal warmth that didn't reach his eyes. "The excitement of the evening has clearly been too much for you. Let Arthur Sterling escort you to the lounge so you can rest." He gestured toward the side of the stage, a dismissive flick of the wrist that he usually reserved for interns or hired help. It was the same tone he'd used for years, the gentle, condescending gaslighting of a man who truly believed his own lies had become reality. "I'm not going anywhere, Julian," she replied. Her voice was steady, cutting through the rising murmurs of the 300 guests like a blade through silk. She reached into the pocket of her tailored jacket and produced a small, silver remote. "You wanted a celebration of the Vance legacy. I think it's time we showed everyone exactly what that legacy looks like when the lights are turned on." She pressed the button. The massive digital screen behind the podium, which had been displaying a soft focus montage of Julian's charitable work, flickered once. Then it transformed. A series of internal bank ledgers appeared, the font crisp and undeniable. The headers were clear: unauthorized transfers, trust account 402. Julian's face underwent a violent transformation. The practiced, televised smile didn't just fade, it curdled. His skin, usually a healthy, expensive tan, drained of color until he resembled a man made of gray wax. A single, frantic pulse throbbed at the base of his throat, and his eyes, normally so cold and calculating, darted toward the screen behind him with the desperation of a trapped animal. His mouth hung slightly open, the arrogance replaced by a hollow, breathless silence that seemed to age him a decade in seconds. He looked less like a powerful CEO and more like a common thief caught with his hand in the drawer. "What is this?" someone shouted from the front row. It was the head of the board, his face a mask of mounting fury as he recognized the account numbers. Celeste Vance gasped, her hand flying to her throat. The heavy diamond necklace she'd bragged about all evening seemed to choke her as she stared at the numbers on the screen, numbers that matched the exact cost of her European shopping spree 2 months prior. She took a sharp step back, physically distancing herself from her husband as if his failure were a contagious disease. Arthur Sterling stepped out from the shadows near the tech booth, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't say a word. He simply nodded toward the screen, his loyalty finally vindicated. Beside him, Isabel Vance stood with her phone raised, recording every second of her brother's public disintegration. "This is a fabrication," Julian finally found his voice, though it came out as a thin, desperate rasp. He turned to the crowd, his hands trembling as he gripped the edges of the podium. "My mother is unwell. She's being manipulated by people who want to see this company fail." "By the truth," Eleanor interrupted. She walked toward the stage now, the sound of her heels on the polished marble echoing through the silent hall like a countdown. "Every signature on those documents is yours, Julian. Every dollar taken from the foundation, every lie told to the board, every attempt to strip your sister of her inheritance. It's all there, documented and verified." The room erupted into a cacophony of hushed, jagged whispers. The socialites who had been clamoring for Julian's attention minutes ago now pulled away, their expressions shifting from fawning admiration to disgusted pity. The scent of the expensive lilies decorating the stage suddenly felt cloying and thick, like the smell of a funeral. Julian looked down at his mother as she reached the base of the stairs. He tried to summon one last shred of his former authority, his chest puffing out, but he was a hollow shell. "You've destroyed everything," he hissed, his voice low enough only for her to hear. "You've ruined the family name." "No," she said, her eyes locked on his with a terrifying calmness. "I've finally cleaned it." She turned her back on him before he could respond, her gaze finding Isabel in the crowd. The weight that had sat on her chest for years was gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. She didn't need to stay and watch him scramble for excuses that no longer existed. The board was already moving toward the stage, their faces grim. "Arthur," she called out, her voice ringing with a new, undisputed authority. "Call the auditors. Tell them the real meeting starts now." She walked toward the exit, the sea of guests parting for her like she was the only person in the room who mattered. Behind her, Julian Vance was left standing under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the spotlight, a man whose empire had turned to dust in the time it took to press a single button. The silence that followed the exit of Eleanor Vance was more deafening than the announcement itself. Julian Vance stood frozen under the harsh glare of the stage lights, the sweat on his brow glistening like oil. He looked at the massive screen behind him, then at the sea of faces that had, only moments ago, been laughing at his jokes and toasted his success. Now, those faces were a wall of judgment. The air in the ballroom felt heavy, thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of his own rising panic. He could hear the hum of the cooling projector, a steady, rhythmic sound that felt like a countdown to his own execution. "It's a fabrication," Julian shouted, his voice cracking and echoing unpleasantly through the sound system. He stepped toward the edge of the stage, his hands trembling as he pointed toward the grand mahogany doors where his mother had vanished. "She's old, she's confused. She's been manipulated. Arthur, tell them. Tell them this is a ridiculous mistake." Arthur Sterling didn't move an inch. He stood at the base of the stage with the board members, his expression carved from granite. He didn't look like a family friend or a mentor anymore. He looked like a man who had finally finished a very long, very distasteful chore. "The auditors are already in the building, Julian," he said, his voice amplified by the microphone still clipped to the podium. "They've been in your office for 2 hours. The digital trail you thought you'd erased. It's all there. Every offshore transfer, every forged signature, and the original deed Eleanor never actually signed." Julian's face underwent a horrifying transformation. The arrogant mask he'd worn for decades didn't just slip, it disintegrated in real time. His skin turned a sickly, translucent gray, making the veins in his neck pulse with a frantic, trapped rhythm. His eyes, usually so sharp and calculating, darted wildly from guest to guest, losing focus as the reality of his situation set in. His mouth hung open, a small, pathetic tremor taking hold of his lower lip, while his chest heaved in shallow, ragged bursts. He looked smaller, suddenly, as if the weight of his lies had physically crushed his spine. The man who had commanded the room with a sneer was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out shell of a son who realized, too late, that the woman he had dismissed as a relic had actually been the one holding the keys to his kingdom. Celeste Vance was the first to move, and she didn't go to her husband's side. Instead, she took a deliberate step back, her silk gown rustling loudly in the quiet room. She looked at Julian with a mixture of disgust and cold, sharp calculation. "I had no idea," she whispered, her voice carrying perfectly to the nearby socialites. "I never would have stayed if I'd known he was stealing from his own mother. It's monstrous." She adjusted her diamond bracelet, already looking toward the exit, her eyes scanning the room for the next lifeboat. The crowd shifted like a tide. Isabel Vance stood near the back, her arms crossed, watching the scene with a grim, quiet satisfaction. She didn't need to say a word. The work was done. The board members were already surrounding Arthur, their backs turned to the man who had been their CEO 5 minutes ago. The socialites who had been clamoring for Julian's attention earlier were now busy deleting photos from their phones, purging any evidence of their association with a thief. 2 men in dark suits, security, though they moved with the clinical precision of bailiffs, approached the stage. Julian tried to push past them, but his legs seemed to fail him. He stumbled, his hand catching on a towering floral arrangement and sending a crystal vase shattering onto the marble floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent hall. "You have 10 minutes to gather your personal effects from the office," Arthur stated, looking down at the man on the floor. He didn't offer a hand. "Eleanor has already signed the papers. The penthouse, the cars, the accounts, they are all frozen pending the criminal investigation. You are no longer a Vance in anything but name, and she's already instructed the legal team to begin the process of stripping that away as well." Julian looked up, his eyes searching for one friendly face, one person to offer a hand or a word of support. He found only the cold, blue glow of cell phone cameras recording his downfall for the morning news. He was alone in a room full of people he had spent his life trying to impress, and not one of them would even look him in the eye. As he was led toward the service exit, away from the cameras and the glitter, the heavy velvet curtains of the ballroom began to close. The final image the guests saw was Julian Vance being escorted out through the same door the catering staff used, a man who had traded his mother's love for a crown of glass, only to watch it shatter at her feet. The silence he left behind was soon replaced by the frantic, excited whispering of the elite, already dissecting the corpse of his reputation before the doors had even fully shut. 6 months had passed since the velvet curtains of the ballroom had swept shut, and with them, the only life Eleanor Vance had ever known. The morning air in the conservatory was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the heavy, sweet perfume of blooming jasmine. It was a quietness she had once feared, a silence she used to fill with the noise of Julian's demands and the frantic energy of trying to keep a crumbling family together. Now, the silence was a luxury she wore like a silk robe. She sat at the wrought iron table, the silver teapot casting a distorted reflection of the lush garden outside. Arthur Sterling sat across from her, his expression more relaxed than she had seen it in decades. He placed a thick manila folder on the table, the heavy thud of paper against glass a grounding sound. "The final signatures were processed yesterday," Arthur said, his voice steady. "The foundation is officially restructured. Every cent Julian attempted to divert has been recovered and tied into a trust that he cannot touch, even with the most expensive lawyers in the city. Not that he can afford them anymore." Eleanor poured the tea, the amber liquid steaming in the cool air. She didn't feel the surge of triumph she might have expected. Instead, there was only a profound sense of order. "And how is my son, Arthur? I know you still receive the reports from the legal team." Arthur took a slow sip of his tea, his eyes drifting to the garden. "He's moved into a 2-bedroom rental in the Heights. It's a respectable neighborhood for most, but for him, it's an exile. I'm told he spent the last week trying to sell his watch collection to cover the back taxes on the penthouse he lost. Celeste moved back to her parents' estate in Connecticut 3 weeks after the gala. She didn't even wait for the divorce papers to be served before she had her things cleared out." Eleanor looked down at her hands. They were steady now, free of the tremor that had plagued her during the years of Julian's gaslighting. She pictured her son in a beige apartment, surrounded by the few designer suits he had managed to keep, staring at a phone that no longer rang. The socialites who had once clamored for an invitation to his table now treated his name like a contagion. In the elite circles of the city, Julian Vance wasn't just a villain, he was a failure. And in their world, failure was the only unforgivable sin. "He called the office again yesterday," Arthur added tentatively. "He wasn't demanding this time. He sounded small. He wanted to know if you would see him for lunch. He said he wanted to apologize for the misunderstandings." Eleanor felt a faint ripple of the old rage, the memory of Julian pouring wine over her dignity, the way he had smirked while calling her incompetent, but it passed quickly, replaced by a cold, clear-eyed realization. He wasn't sorry for the pain he had caused. He was sorry that the world now knew who he was. He was a predator who had lost his teeth, trying to crawl back to the only person he thought he could still manipulate. "I have nothing to say to him, Arthur." "And I certainly have nothing to hear," she said, her voice like polished stone. "The misunderstandings were quite clear. He showed me exactly who he was, and I have finally decided to believe him." The sound of heels clicking on the marble floor announced Isabel's arrival. Eleanor's daughter looked radiant, the sharp lines of her professional suit softened by the genuine smile she wore. She carried a stack of architectural plans, spreading them out over the table with a flourish. "The community center in the East End is ready for the groundbreaking," Isabel said, her eyes bright with a purpose Eleanor had never seen in her before their alliance. "We're naming the library wing after Dad. Arthur helped me secure the old textile mill property." Eleanor traced the lines of the blueprints. This was the Vance legacy now, not a hoard of wealth guarded by a narcissistic gatekeeper, but something that breathed and grew. She had lost a son, or perhaps she had simply lost the illusion of one, but she had gained a daughter and her own soul in the exchange. "It's beautiful, Isabel," Eleanor whispered. As the two of them began to discuss the logistics of the opening, Eleanor's gaze drifted to a framed photograph on the side table. It was an old picture of Julian as a boy, standing on the lawn of this very estate, looking up at the camera with a smile that hadn't yet learned how to lie. That boy was gone, buried under layers of entitlement and greed that she had, in her own way, helped to foster by never saying no. The cost of her freedom had been the total destruction of the family name she had spent 40 years protecting. It was a heavy price, a bittersweet victory that left a hollow ache in her chest when the sun went down. But as she picked up her pruning shears to tend to the roses, she felt the weight of the silver key in her pocket, the key to a life where she was no longer a resource to be mined, but a woman to be feared and respected. She walked toward the rose bushes, the sharp snip of the blades echoing in the quiet garden. She cut away a withered, blackened bud that was draining the strength from a healthy stem. It was a necessary cruelty. To let the garden thrive, the rot had to be removed, no matter how much it hurt to cut it away. Eleanor stood tall in the sunlight, a queen of a smaller, humbler kingdom, finally at peace in the ruins of her own making.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.